when we are talking about written communication, we are talking about how important or essential this is. And before we begin with its importance, let's understand a few characteristics of written communication. We all know that this is a creative activity. Written communication is something that requires a lot of imagination along with a lot of effort. When we're talking about imagination and effort, this effort is not in terms of writing alone, this effort is in terms of framing your sentences using the appropriate vocabulary, making sure that the end user who's receiving that message clearly understands it. Here, when we're talking about the common characteristics, we are also talking about how spontaneously we're able to communicate when it comes to verbal communication. But written communication has a lot of effort involved in it. When we're talking about the very nature of writing, we're talking about the practice of patience, because you are learning while you're doing stuff. You're learning how creatively you can frame that message, use of vocabulary, sentence structure, punctuations, grammar, etc. While on the other end, you're also making sure that the person you're sending this information to should be able to understand it clearly. When we're talking about this communication method, we're also talking about the time factor involved. Here, the time usually taken to convey a written communication is a bit longer in comparison to the verbal communication. Here, when we're talking about this entire characteristic, we're talking about how much creativity is required in the written communication. Imagination, creativity are an integral part of written communication. While on the other end, the verbal communication is more spontaneous. Written communication is totally based on the conscious efforts being put in. Let's understand this through an example. Supposingly, you're hearing to a news reporter. The news reporter has to spontaneously deliver that piece of information or that news to you as a viewer. Whereas when you read a newspaper, the person has to curate the content in a specified way, in a logical order. The information should be sequential. He or she cannot simply mention any bit and piece anywhere. When we are talking about these cases, the spoken messages or verbal communications become quite easy. But here, the written communications are all the more effective. Written communication has only a few cycles rather than the face-to-face or verbal oral communication. When we're talking about these characteristics, let's see the time factor involved when it comes to writing this message. Verbal messages, that is, in a face-to-face situation or through telephonic conversations, reach the receiver immediately. Whereas when we're talking about these written communication, they take some amount of time. The person who's writing this message, or the person who's the sender ideally, has to plan the message. As in, whether I'm supposed to write a letter, an email, or a report. And we have to make sure that all the essentials that I have to convey are there in that message without the message sounding confusing. When I'm talking about all these things, there's one more important factor to be considered.